Good evening, everybody. So I really liked the visual style of the last presentation deck. It's the one that I try and use myself most of the time, to have a strong visual anchor on every page, give everybody something to remember. So I could blame my lack of graphics on the S3 outage last night and kind of say, yeah, they were all in the cloud and the cloud ate my homework. But the truth is that Ops is just a kind of boring, non-visual thing. And especially once you take away eyes on glass and hands on keyboards, then what are the pictures to go with Ops? So this is going to be a little bit texty, but not bullet-ridden corpses all the way through. As Ant said, I'm the CTO for Global Infrastructure Services at CSC. CSC is one of those funny companies where people have either heard of it or haven't. And for those of you that haven't heard of it, it's a large American-based systems integrator. So we have about 65,000 people in the company. And here in the UK, we look after accounts like Network Rail, lots of NHS stuff, and other government departments and sort of quasi-government type stuff. We're just about to merge with HP's enterprise services business. So there's going to be a new company launch at the beginning of April. So those of you passing through airports will probably see our marketing where you used to see the Accenture marketing. In my day job, Global Infrastructure Services is roughly half of the company. That means we've got about 12,000 people involved in delivery of projects, and about half of those in kind of day-to-day operational type roles. And I've spent the last year and something trying to get those people to move towards an infrastructure as code world. So less eyes on screens and hands on keyboards, and more Git, GitHub, Ansible, Jenkins, and that kind of stuff. So things that I expect most of you are all familiar with. It's a different story when you're talking to people that have never used SSH or touched a shell. I've kind of proudly noted here, I've been an AWS user since 2005, and the sharp-witted amongst you will be like, didn't EC2 not launch until 2006? And actually, even before EC2 launched, there was Amazon Web Services, and it was a SOAP interface where you could look up books using the ISBNs and various other references. And I used to use it as a testing point for various web servicey things that I was messing around with. I've carried on using AWS all the way through. I am not a Lambda or API gateway expert. So this talk is really inspired by a write-up I did for InfoQ following the Serverless conference here in London a few months back. And the theme that emerged for me on day one of that conference was operations is not a solved problem. That people are using serverless and they're getting great benefits from serverless, but it doesn't just kind of magic away all of the operational considerations that we had when we were still dealing with servers. I'd go so far at this point to say, actually, the only thing it magics away is the operations problems unique to managing servers themselves. So what Amazon and the rest of the cloud providers have done is a great wrapper around servers and the scaling of servers so that you don't have to be concerned with that. But everything else to do with operations is still there. This is not my own work. I think we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And in this case, I'm kind of standing mostly on the shoulders of Charity Majors here. So Charity, I think, did one of the best talks at that serverless conference. Many of you will have been there and seen it. And she lent very heavily on her experiences from Parse, which is the mobile application development platform that was acquired by Facebook and then shut down. And Charity's now doing a monitoring startup called Honeycomb. And she blended the experiences that she had, first of all, working at Parse, and as one of the first ops people getting into Parse. And then more recently, looking at the customers that she's worked with at Honeycomb and some of the emerging high-scale demands around monitoring that she's seeing there. Patrick Dubois gave the introductory keynote. Patrick is basically credited with kind of inventing DevOps. He was the guy who was at an ITIL conference of all things, and kind of got together a birds of a feather group and sort of said, we can do better than this. And so he organized the first DevOps day in Ghent over in Belgium, which is his native country. And he's been one of the cheerleaders for DevOps ever since. And I think he had a very interesting take in his introductory keynote on really what's going on with the operations side of serverless. And is it a magic wand that's whisking away lots of operational concerns, or do they still need to be dealt with? Rafael gave a good talk on serverless in the enterprise. That's already starting to happen. I deal day by day with enterprises, and we talk about Simon Wardley's pioneers, settlers, town planner model when we're working with our customers. And even with what you would consider to be stodgy, kind of somewhat backward-looking organizations, many of them are getting into using that pioneers, settlers, town planners model. And the pioneers are certainly looking towards using everything that's in the arsenal available to them from the cloud service providers. And there's very much a leaning towards serverless and particularly Lambda, and also a good deal of Cloud Foundry going on. Paul Johnston expected to be here this evening and then ended up sort of sending his apologies. I think he'll be a familiar face to many of you. He works at a startup where they've run entirely on serverless. And he got into the game pretty early, so he's been swimming against the tide occasionally, having to invent the things to make it work shortly before other people come along with much better engineered solutions and much more resilience. But it's kind of interesting to follow those stories and see the challenges. And he kind of oscillates between explaining how he has a wonderful life because of serverless, because he doesn't have to manage things anymore. And he has a terrible life because of serverless, because it's so immature and everything doesn't quite work as well as it ought to. So the TLDR for this talk is no server not equals no ops. So Amazon, Google, Azure, pick your poison, may have taken the servers away from you, and they might be managing the servers on your behalf. But ops is still there. And all of the ops challenges are pretty much still there. So there's a lot still to be done. Charity summed it up in this way. And her perspective here was that ops was an important cultural part of organizations that are doing IT. And whether they're doing IT in traditional manners or whether they're doing IT in novel manners, the way they do ops becomes part of how they do things around here, my favorite definition of culture. And so it's a cultural artifact. And if you're starting an organization and trying to build something around serverless, or you're trying to introduce serverless to your organization, you are by definition trying to build or change or shape a culture. And the operational considerations are going to bear into that. So a simplistic view here would be ops are these things. It's not even a particularly exhaustive list, but it's a good kind of starter for 4. Provisioning, config management, monitoring, and logging. And you kind of ask yourself the question, what are those things? How do they relate to what I'm trying to do with serverless? And what does that end up meaning? So provisioning. Simplistically, copying files. It's kind of from the dawn of IT, when we've had to get some code into the right place to be run in production, that's generally meant copying files. And it's no different with serverless. And the reason that provisioning has become a thing, and provisioning is even a class of software in its own right, especially in the enterprise context, is it starts to get complicated. That simple act of copying files around becomes burdensome as soon as you've got different files going to different environments, and you start having the sort of matrix layers stacking up on top of each other, and all of the various different combinatorial complexity that emerges out of that. And so when you start out with serverless, starting up the AWS CLI for Lambda, or just doing it in the console, or maybe using a framework like the serverless framework, the provisioning piece seems super straightforward. But as soon as you start thinking about, oh, okay, I've got to manage a dev environment, a test environment, a production environment, a staging environment, immediately you're starting to create a great amount of complexity for yourself. And you have to start thinking about, how do I actually do provisioning? Often closely related to provisioning is config management. And I think in the world of DevOps, and especially a world of DevOps which has been often misdefined by config management tools like Puppet and Ansible and Chef and Salt and all of the rest of them, there's been a kind of conflation between config management and DevOps. So simplistically, config management is, if provisioning's copying files, config management is checking the state of files. Are files that define the config of my system where I expect them to be, saying what I expect them to say? And if we look at that sort of reel of config management tools that I just went through, that's what they do. Now, the challenge here in a serverless environment is I'm not looking after the config files anymore. I'm working through the glove box of an API to define configuration. And so all of the tools that have grown up around checking a file don't work for me anymore. So it takes us towards either bolting API capabilities onto the config management of old, or stepping into a brave new world of API-based config management tools. And both things are happening in parallel, as you might expect. Monitoring. Is my thing alive? Is it performing like I would expect it to be? There were some good questions about monitoring in the last session. And I think the challenges around monitoring have been consistent over time. Monitoring tends to be the thing that differentiates grown-up IT in production being run by serious organizations versus stuff just being kind of YOLO'd into production by people that don't know what they're doing. If you're not monitoring your stuff, you don't know when it's not working. And the answers around serverless monitoring at the moment aren't particularly high quality. And once again, the hooks that we've had in the past for things like SNMP traps, or how busy a CPU is, or how much RAM we're using, have kind of all gone away. So a lot of monitoring was anchored in the concept of, is my server busy, and do I need another one? And when you take the servers away, that question goes away with it. But the monitoring considerations don't go away. And it becomes especially important with dependencies, which I'll touch upon in a second. So there was a somewhat oblique question at the end of the last session about essentially how hard are you pounding your database? And the use case for One Fine Stay essentially washed out as we don't have that many people that can possibly use the mobile app at one time, and so they can't pound our database too hard. Different story altogether, and it was mentioned, if you're running a gaming app and that gaming app suddenly takes off because you made top 10 download on the Apple App Store or something, then you're in a different world altogether in terms of managing your dependencies. And monitoring is the thing that's going to let you know how that's working out for you. And then finally, logging. It's another kind of one of those signs of maturity that applications are producing the right kind of logs and the infrastructure is there to understand them. Elk also got mentioned in the last time around. This was one of the things that Raffle kind of held his hands up to when he was talking about enterprise serverless, and said, Yeah, that was the one thing that we couldn't do serverless. We ended up spinning up an EC2 instance and running elk on it. And the crucial thing there is the logging frameworks that are run by the cloud service providers are still very much kind of tubes that you can send messages down. And it's still an exercise for the reader to figure out what you're going to do with those messages. And especially the search piece of it. If you want to go back in time and find a message that applied to an event that you didn't realize was important until much later on, then that's where you start to get into trouble. And that's where you kind of wish that you had the Elasticsearch piece of the elk stack, which is presently, I think, where I'd expect the cloud service providers to get on top of that. They normally do this innovate, leverage, commoditize thing of figuring out what people need and then building it into the services. But it takes a bit of time. So you could ask the question, will Terraform save you? And Charity did a great blog post shortly after the Serverless conference about her own adventures with Terraform. And the answer is a bit, I think. Terraform can help. And so if you want a config management tool that's been designed for an API native environment rather than to change files, Terraform is the thing. And there's not many of them out there at the moment. The other question you could ask is, will the serverless framework save you? And it's been designed to save you an awful lot of activation energy. It's been designed to take some of these operational considerations into account. And I think it'll get you a good way down the road. It's a very helpful set of tools. And so I think the answer once again is partially, but not completely. When we think about config, one of the areas which struck me as an area of config complexity that just simply didn't go away was identity. And so AWS, if we're using Lambda, gives us IAM. And IAM roles and serverless go together like peanut butter and chocolate and Reese's Pieces or whatever. But that's a lot of things to configure. And the naive approach to doing that is lots of clicking around in the AWS console, but that simply doesn't give you repeatability and it doesn't give you something that you can scale later on. It kind of gets worse when you get into things like Cognito. So I was seeing a post on a forum a week or two ago, and it was sort of, I'm going to use Cognito, how do I back it up? There wasn't a good answer to that. Because if you build that app and it's a game or something and millions of people come along and sign into it to save their scores or whatever, then Cognito's done a huge amount of heavy lifting for you. It was something I played with just after launch, and it really is one of those things that can accelerate a lot of that grunt work in doing mobile app development. But all of that stuff then kind of belongs to Amazon. And if you do something stupid that ends up deleting your 1 million users, then bad luck, because there's really no great way at the moment of dealing with replicating that identity. Databases came up last session. State management is huge, and state management feels to me like the great unsolved problem of IT at the moment. Whether we're talking about containers, whether we're talking about platform as a service and Cloud Foundry and 12-factor, and especially when we're talking about serverless, state management is always left as, that's a service that we don't do here, we do it over there. And stuff like DynamoDB is great. Stuff like Google Cloud Spanner, which was just launched a week or two ago, is even better. But putting together the state management piece and the serverless piece, which tends to be stateless, is still a tricky piece of construction. And again, managing then the provisioning and the config management around that becomes quite complex. I think with particular reference to state management, Charity made this comment of the service will protect itself, and it will often protect itself at your expense. So one of the things she saw a lot with Parse was people who were able to write applications that hammered the state management layer at the back end and busted the limits on it. And they just shut those apps down. So you might be just about on your way to the new million-selling game, and then suddenly your back end has been turned off for you, and all of your users are going, this sucks, 1 star. And that's really bad. So you don't want that to be happening. So the point she made was, need to understand the critical path, own the critical path, and keep that short. So who knew before last night that S3 was a critical dependency to deploying a new function? That understanding of the tech and what makes up its dependencies is important. So Amazon might be doing a whole bunch of heavy lifting for you behind the scenes, but it's up to you to kind of grok how that works, and particularly grok how that breaks, because it's still your app when it goes down. So that's all I had.